Welcome to our webinar, Collaborating for Net Zero, Insights and Strategies for Sustainable Telco Networks. My name is Bhushan Joshi. I'm the Head of Sustainability for Ericsson in North America. By 2028, mobile subscriptions and mobile data traffic per smartphone is expected to increase by 21%, and 5G penetration is expected to reach up to 90%, or will exceed 90% in North America, which would be the highest around the world. As demand for mobile services and data continues to increase, without action, network energy consumption and carbon emissions associated with it are expected to increase as well. CSPs are setting targets to reach net zero emissions for their entire value chain within the next 10 to 15 years. To achieve these targets, it's going to be important for CSPs to collaborate with telco vendors and try to find ways to reach these net zero objectives. In this webinar, we'll discuss the key strategies that we need to deploy in order to reach net zero and create sustainable networks of the future. I'd like to welcome my co-panelists, and I'll start by asking them to introduce themselves. So Kim, why don't you go first?
Sure. Hi, my name is Kim Johnson, and I'm a principal analyst at ABI Research. ABI Research is a technology intelligence firm. We have offices in New York, London, and Singapore, and I head the Sustainable Technologies Group at ABI Research.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Mike, please.
I'm Mike Murphy, and I'm CTO for North America of Ericsson.
Great. So thanks again for joining. Super interesting conversation. So we'll kind of kick off with a short keynote by Kim. And Kim, your firm recently did a pretty comprehensive analysis of telco vendors. There's some really interesting results from that analysis that we would love if you could share with the audience. So please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Bhushan. So today I have a brief keynote address. I'll try to keep things moving. If you have any specific questions about any of the topics, you're welcome to write me at ABI Research. We do spend quite a bit of time. We first did an analysis for telco mobile network operators and did a sustainability index assessing global operators and all of the sustainability platforms, programs that go into making more sustainable telco operators. And then again, we conducted an analysis, a sustainability assessment of over 80 vendors, and Ericsson was named the most sustainable vendor in that analysis. And so that's why we're here. This was our very objective, unbiased research, and again, Ericsson was named most sustainable vendor. But today we just want to cover these insights and strategies for sustainable networks. So this is a little bit what I'll cover in the keynote. First, we'll talk a little bit about the assessment and the methodology of the assessment. Then we'll talk about the overall results. We'll spend the most time talking about what makes a sustainable network. That includes renewable energy use globally, and we'll cover some of the CSPs or MNOs for that. And then also what makes a sustainable base station. And then we'll finish up with a bit on the energy efficiency. So this slide covers the ABI Research Sustainability Assessment. Again, why did we do this? We have a very large telecom presence and research presence. We have a large 5G group with a lot of data. And then we also really wanted to dig into the sustainability of the sector. So that's kind of why we explored this topic. We also see the telecom industry as, some call it the enabling effect, right? And think about all of the decarbonization that can be enabled by 5G technology, whether it's through smart cities, autonomous vehicles, digital health, telehealth, smart agriculture, smart buildings. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in our panel discussion too. So this is why we chose the telecom industry to conduct this research. What we also wanted to do, some consulting firms, they have sustainability groups, and they also have telecom groups, but you may just get one article or another written on sustainability, but otherwise it's focused in those two areas. This overlaps. So we looked at all of the vendors in the telco ecosystem just through a sustainability lens. So for the methodology, we first, and this took several analysts to work on this project, we had 9 network equipment categories: massive MIMO, 5G RAN, 5G Open RAN, on-site renewable energy, liquid cooling, primarily data centers, free cooling, AI-driven software, antenna solutions, and 5G cloud-native platforms. And what we did is we scored. We had very detailed criteria for each of those, and we provided each vendor participating in that network equipment area with a score. Then that overall score was rolled up into the final results. So this is a summary slide on how, so Ericsson competed in 6 different network equipment categories, again, from over 80 vendors. And the things that really stood out about Ericsson, we've got the eco design. And what does that mean? How is that different? Essentially, the close co-design of the silicon with the hardware integrated with the software, right? Designing the silicon has a very specific purpose within the telecom architecture. So that was one factor. Certainly the energy reduction efforts, again, you see the statistics, basebands 30 to 60% more efficient. Massive MIMO radios have 50% improved energy efficiency compared to earlier generations. We spoke with the head of sustainability, we spoke with the head of energy management. Ericsson provided questionnaire and lots of data to support this. And again, this was for impact. This was the innovation and advanced features for reducing emissions or waste. Another thing that stood out about Ericsson, I just took a tour of their 5G Smart Factory here in Texas. It's been named a World Economic Forum Sustainability Lighthouse, not just an Industry 4.0 or an advanced lighthouse, but it's also a sustainability lighthouse. So sustainable manufacturing was another scoring criteria. Also, how is Ericsson affecting its supply chain? And then finally, for impact, the overall vendor strategy. Ericsson's working with GSMA and the Climate Action Group and lots of other industry organizations to ensure that other telco ecosystem members get to net zero. And then you can see here, reduced CO2 emissions by 60% just between 2016 and 2022. On the implementation side, we also evaluated how a vendor had the ability to scale impact and kind of what is the footprint of all of this technology, whether it's hardware, software, and how that scales across the industry. So again, Ericsson led 5G global market share, over 50% of the global traffic outside of China is carried on Ericsson networks. So again, 145 live 5G networks. That changes a bit, in the data that's sent to us, but nevertheless, that footprint, the ability to scale reduction of carbon made Ericsson stand out. So this slide shows our overall results. We decided to break up the results into traditional vendors, non-traditional vendors, chipset and component vendors, and software vendors. Again, you can't possibly compare, let's say, an Intel, who's an IDM. They design and make their chips. They're producing hardware on the processor side. They also have software and the carbon emissions from a manufacturing firm. Same for Ericsson, right? They're manufacturing physical products versus a software developer. So it's not just about the numbers. We wanted to evaluate, again, against very detailed criteria, how sustainable are these vendors? What's their strategy? We certainly have companies in here. People have asked, this chipset is very energy efficient. Well, it's also evaluating, right, impact versus implementation. So some of it is also the footprint across the global telco ecosystem that may have given one company a higher score. But you can see Ericsson was our most sustainable vendor, and go to the next. So this is what we do at ABI Research, is we try to aggregate what makes a sustainable telco network. And we try to look at global telecommunications companies and what are all of the different things that are going into their sustainable programs. So if you had to summarize what's the roadmap to net zero, you could pretty much summarize with renewable energy, energy efficient networks, and carbon offsets. So that's a succinct way of how mobile network operators are getting to net zero. Certainly you could include affecting, if I had to add one more, I would probably say, how are you influencing your supply chain and reduction of emissions across that? But what makes a sustainable network? So certainly renewable energy. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And then, one action that mobile network operators have is investing in energy efficient network equipment and operations. And we're going to talk a lot about that in our panel. Certainly, we've got migrating to 5G. We know that that's more efficient, up to 90% per bit of data. We understand that 5G may take 2 to 3x the coverage, right? You need that network densification for the coverage, and also increased data traffic has increased the overall data traffic load. But nevertheless, 5G is more efficient than 4G. Replacing copper with fiber, we are seeing 85% improved efficiency. Again, not as much a factor in North America, but certainly globally. Retiring 3G and legacy systems, again, averages up to 15% energy reduction. Some other sustainable network programs, obviously investing in latest generation multiband and massive MIMO units, basebands, small cells for indoor use, right? 80% of data is consumed indoors, and they're, again, efficient ways to intelligently map 5G. AI-enabled software, we'll talk about that again more on a later slide. Somewhere 15 to 30% energy savings, depending on which company, which vendor. On-site renewable energy, obviously that cuts down on the diesel fuel for especially low-grid, off-grid sites. We've got free and liquid cooling systems, digital twins used for more sustainable networks. I've got listed here, Verizon has conducted an energy digital twin, says they've saved over 100 million a year. And then certainly energy efficiency programs. We've got AT&T with its energy scorecard. We have all kinds of, from the building level to massive KPIs used across the network level to reduce energy. I'll touch briefly a little bit on the waste and circularity. Certainly an example here, that European telcos have come together, Vodafone, Orange, Telefonica, Telia, and they have an eco rating system, and they're rating over 200 phones. That's been just since May of 2021. And again, you can rate mobile phones based on durability, repairability, recyclability, resource efficiency, and climate efficiency. So again, it helps consumers make informed choices. Certainly green buildings and vehicles are at the company level are a way to reduce emissions. And then some reporting and governance examples that we can talk about. Obtain third-party carbon emissions verification. Certainly AT&T has used Carbon Trust over the years, not only to calculate its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but also to try to calculate that enabling effect, right? They've made this, we're going to reduce a gigaton of our customers' carbon emissions by 2035. And again, that's 1 billion metric tons. So that's helpful. Using green bonds, we'll talk about that. Obviously, Verizon is very engaged with that, just issued its 5th $1 billion bond to fund its renewable energy. Increasing bid phase sustainability weightings in the procurement contracts. Again, Deutsche Telekom used to be 10% for the sustainability criteria and the scoring for bid phase contracts. Now it's 20%. So again, you're telling your suppliers, if you can't meet our sustainability criteria, you won't get the contract. And then finally, remuneration. If I learned anything in business school, it's all about incentives. And you think about company level remuneration at Telefonica, for example, 20% of the variable compensation for all employees is tied to ESG criteria, and 5% is directly tied to reducing greenhouse gases. So this is a slide I thought you all might be interested in. These are all the global telco operators with 100% renewable energy use across global networks. So this is impressive. Obviously, Swisscom, KPN have been using green electricity since 2010, 2011. But that's definitely a rapid decarbonization action that telco operators can take. And then this slide covers additional telco operators with renewable energy targets. So you can see in that middle column, all of these mobile network operators have committed to 100% energy use with a year pledged. And so that's pretty important. Another thing you can see by market, right? You see NTT Docomo, Rakuten, SoftBank. Once one sustainability leader steps out there, commits to the RE100, says we commit to 100% energy use by this year, amazingly, others will follow, right, in the same market. We saw that with SK Telecom. SK Group was the first from South Korea to join the RE100 initiative several years ago, 100% by 2050. Then KT followed, LGU Plus followed. We see the market in Taiwan, and then certainly we're also seeing that in the US. We'll talk about that in a bit. So once a company has reached 100% renewable electricity, we talked about that second major action, right? How do we make the network more energy efficient? And so in this, we'll start, you can see this graphic. First, we do start with 100% renewable energy in the energy supply. And you saw on the last slide, Ericsson's calculated that the ICT sector can essentially remove 80% of its carbon if all of the mobile network operators used renewable electricity. So that's one action. And then from there, we discussed that you go to the legacy equipment, right? Switch off legacy technologies, 3G, 2G, and we're seeing that globally. That's one thing we track in our 5G group and in the sustainability group. From there, you look at the RAN, right? We know 70 to 80% of the energy comes from the access network, and that includes the active and the passive equipment. So certainly, again, multi-band, latest generation, more powerful silicon in the remote radio unit, in the basebands. That is a big part of reducing that 70% of energy use. Certainly software usage, we see power savings features. And then again, those are basically powering down, whether it's sleep, microsleep, shutdowns of the 5G network to save energy. Other measures, certainly the power unit rectifiers, that's the conversion. There's a lot of energy loss in the conversion from AC to DC power. And obviously any type of IoT equipment for remote monitoring, and then also making the site intelligent is helpful. And then connecting the passive equipment to decision makers. And then finally, the infrastructure. We're seeing a lot of telcos around the world kind of modernize. We're going from a large equipment room with using air conditioning and refrigerant gases. And then again, we're making that more compact, right? And the equipment's getting more compact, and the batteries are getting more compact, and all of the other components. But again, modernizing that. Moving to efficient cooling, using ambient outside air and ventilation for free, and also liquid cooling. And then also using lithium or pure lead batteries versus lead acid. And finally, this will help lead us into the panel discussion, right? Why is energy so important for telco operators? You can see that telco networks are 2 to 3% of the total global energy demand. So that's a huge amount of energy powering these networks. And 20 to 40% of that, network energy costs are 20 to 40% of OpEx from operators. So this is one thing, particularly with electricity costs as high as they are. Another interesting thing I thought in this graphic, and again, it might be that the print is very small, but one thing that I thought was really interesting, the spectrum purchases always make the news in terms of, CNBC in 2021, like Verizon spent $45 billion on C-band spectrum, yet you see that's only 3%. This is the total cost of ownership of a network in a mostly developed market. So you see that that's actually a very small percentage compared to the total cost of ownership of the utility bill or the operational costs of that network. So that just leads us, operators have the power to cut this energy consumption. Like I said, I just toured the factory. If we could find incentives to invest in this latest generation equipment, the 5G energy curve can be broken with, again, precise 5G deployment and investment in this equipment. And again, that collaboration. I have here, Ericsson and Nokia report that 93 to 94% of their total carbon emissions come from the portfolio use of equipment. So actions taken by mobile network operators can significantly reduce the carbon emissions of the network infrastructure providers. So that's how interconnected this sector is.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kim. Really appreciate you sharing your perspective. And I had a couple of thoughts that came to my mind as you were going through this material. I think one key insight that I would take away from this is that the reaching net zero is a shared industry responsibility. Our journey to net zero or the operator customers' journeys to net zero run through each other's efforts. So really appreciate you bringing that out. So we'll jump into the panel now. And the way we're thinking about doing this is that we're going to structure it into kind of three buckets. So we'll start by talking about kind of the big picture. What's the big picture on climate change? What's the big picture when it comes to the ICT sector? Then we'll transition into talking about tipping points. Are we reaching tipping points? Are we now at a point now where decisions are going to be made that will accelerate the climate action exponentially, because that's what we need to do. And then finally, we get into the last bucket where we'll talk a little bit more about how will this transformation happen? How do we kind of go about doing this? What sort of technologies, what sort of strategies do we really need to deploy in order to reach net zero? And I just wanted to say for the audience that's joining us today, keep the questions coming. I'm seeing some really interesting ones come through, and I'll kind of start bringing them up as we go into the session here. But let me kind of open up the discussion. Kim, and I think you got into this a little bit in your keynote, but help us set some kind of, help us kind of define some key terms. We threw around net zero quite a bit. What is net zero? And when you look at the emissions profile of a typical telco operator, what does that kind of look like?
Sure. So we were just discussing all of the confusing terms, right, in the sustainability word and the alphabet soup and the word salad. So we'll clarify a couple things. So when you hear the term net zero, again, there are various standards, but the Science Based Targets Initiative establishes net zero as a goal of removing all the greenhouse gases that a company or an entity produces. So whereas carbon neutrality could be a company that is doing everything that it can to reduce all of its emissions operationally. They get it down to a few unabated emissions, and then the company purchases carbon offsets or carbon credits to offset any unabated emissions. And even the sustainability leaders in every industry to some degree uses carbon offsets, whether they're purchased or it's nature-based solutions. There are various types. But that's something to think about. So even we have several mobile network operators that are already climate neutral or carbon neutral. We've got KPN has been carbon neutral since 2015, and they use carbon offsets to offset any unabated emissions. Telia has been carbon neutral since 2020, but again, they use carbon offsets. And then net zero takes carbon neutrality even one step further and says, hey, we need to remove all of the greenhouse gases. That includes methane, nitrous oxides, all of the other kind of higher global warming potent gases. Net zero takes that one step further.
Great. So I think we kind of help. So I think it's important to define some of these terms: carbon neutrality versus net zero. I think the standard for net zero that the ITU has come up with really takes this whole value chain approach in terms of reducing carbon emissions throughout the entire value chain and only offsetting those that are technically unfeasible to eliminate. I think let's switch to Mike now. Mike, you've been sitting there patiently. But so we talked about this, right? So as demand for mobile networks continues to grow, and we're seeing 5G networks deployed nationwide, what is the anticipated impact of network energy consumption, specifically in North America?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've done a little homework.
Great.
So there's some good news and bad news.
Okay.
But I'll start with the bad news first
Okay.
and end with the good news, end on a happy note.
Okay.
So the bad news, so Kim, you mentioned 70-80% of an operator's energy consumption is from the radio access network. So we would agree on that. And that's largely driven by increase in the number of subscribers, more data consumption, more spectrum, new spectrum, and densification. Mm. And in general, all of those things are kind of going in, let's say, the wrong direction. Mm. In 3G to 4G, we went from 1 to 6 billion mobiles. Probably we won't add another 5 billion mobiles in 5G because there's not that many people on the planet, but we will add other devices. So it's quite conceivable we might even exceed that. And you mentioned the Ericsson Mobility Report, Bhushan, 21% data CAGR.
Yeah.
But actually, when we looked at urban centers in 5G only, so not including LT, the numbers can go into the several hundreds of % increase.
Oh, wow.
So we need to see where that settles at the end of 5G. And in 5G, we added a lot of spectrum. And unfortunately, we added like mid-band and millimeter wave, which are really far apart. Mm-hmm. You can't make a radio that covers all that. So, essentially by definition, you have to add new radios. Mm-hmm. And then, as you mentioned, Kim, there's some densification going on. The whole promise of 5G with low latency, you have to densify, do that. So things are kind of going in the wrong direction there. So we did a calculation for the US. And roughly speaking, there's about 3.5 million radios in the US. Mm. And we add about 5% are net new additions per year. So roughly around 175,000 radios. So 175,000 consumes a lot of radios. So how much? So we did a calculation from 21 to 25, and we forecast that energy consumption would increase by about 45%, or 2,000 gigawatt hours, roughly equal to 200,000 homes. My colleagues don't like me saying it, but I say, we're adding a nuclear reactor every 5 years or so. But that's all the downside. The good part is everybody's a lot more conscientious, including Ericsson, in developing better products, better site solutions, network features that can reduce consumption. Mm-hmm. And I honestly, we didn't make this up, but we did in that same study, we said, what if we modernize the network pretty aggressively? Not 100%, not replacing 3.5 million radios, but pretty aggressive modernization. And we calculated we could reduce consumption by 36%. Then we said, okay, well, why don't we use our smartest AI features to turn off radios when they're idle or when an adjacent cell can take over the traffic? And we calculated another 9%, so 45%. So actually, putting all that together, we could actually flatten the energy curve if we used all of those tools that are available. So I think the message there is we have the tools. The question is, what is the incentive and how do you make it financially practical to execute on that?
Interesting. And we talked about this a little bit, right? And I think that leads us really nicely into the next section of our talk. But it's all about those tipping points. We have the solutions. We have these targets that we've set up. There's a lot of drivers that are driving the industry towards taking these steps to get towards a more sustainable future. Are we at those tipping points? So I think maybe Kim, I'll kind of go back to you. Through the great research that you've done and you've looked at different stakeholders, can you share some perspective in terms of kind of the regulatory frameworks, the investor class, even consumers? Are they helping us drive towards this moment of critical mass? The tipping point, of course, defined as an idea where things go, I don't want to say viral, but they go viral, right? They go from, regular to an exponential action. So are we there? And what do you see in the market?
Right. Good. So good question. Mike led this with the good news, bad news, right? So maybe we're not quite there.
Okay.
However, I do think, and I do work in sustainability, so perhaps there's a slight bias, but I do see significant, measurable actions that have been taken in the direction to address climate change and to reduce carbon emissions. Some examples, some statistics of that. If you go, I mentioned the Science-Based Targets Initiative. If you look at the data, even if you just look back a few years to 2018, 2019, and look at the number of companies globally that have committed to science-based targets. And again, if there are different pathways, right? 2 degrees, somewhere in between, and 1.5 degrees, which typically implies as a company, you'll cut your emissions in half by 2030 and be net zero by 2050. That's typically aligning with the 1.5 degree scenario. But I see measurable progress in that today. It's over 5,300 companies, and that curve is exponential in terms of just in the last, say, 3 to 5 years of companies taking climate action, right? You can't manage what you don't measure. So the measurement and the monitoring, actually, figuring out, hey, what are my scope 1 carbon emissions, scope 2, scope 3 carbon emissions? So I do see progress in that. Some of the tipping point mechanisms, I think there are a few contributors. It's never one thing, right? It's a lot of factors. But I can say on the investment side, in the last few years, we've seen lots of inflows into investors that are saying, hey, we want to invest in companies that are producing more than just profits. So we think companies can do more, and we want to put our money into that, right? So again, this is after the financial obligations to shareholders are met, then we can address the needs of other stakeholders, like taking care of our employees, ensuring fair labor practices, reducing our environmental footprint. So there are lots of different ways, but I definitely see the global markets pushing and indicating that addressing climate change is more than any one government. It's more than any one politician. It's more than any one company can do, right? It's this collaborative, it's technological innovation, and it's collaboration. And so I definitely see momentum in the capital markets towards investing in companies that are reducing their environmental impact. On the regulatory side, if we look ahead, we're already seeing mandatory climate disclosures for the largest companies in the UK and also in Japan. That was in April of 2022. The US SEC has a climate rule that's in process now. Again, mandatory climate disclosure for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We'll see that's still in the review process. There's a lot of pushback. So we'll see where that lands. Even if that doesn't go into full effect, California also has legislation proposed for companies operating in California, over $1 billion for mandatory climate disclosure. You've also got several efforts in the EU. It's called the CSRD, or Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And again, between fiscal year 2024 and 2028, it's going to open up to 50,000 EU and non-EU companies that are required to disclose their carbon emissions. So again, not one thing, but it's coming. And certainly global supply chains are interconnected. And so an ambitious EU agenda is going to affect US companies with operations in the EU. We're also seeing kind of supply chain due diligence legislation, greenwashing legislation. We're seeing circular economy legislation. We have the carbon tax coming in the EU in October 23, starting in different industries. So again, there's momentum. Have we reached a complete tipping point yet? Maybe that's up for debate, but there certainly is increased interest in addressing climate change.
Great. So, I mean, I think that was a good perspective, kind of looking out and kind of seeing how this issue is evolving. And what I get from what you just shared, Kim, is that so there is a lot of momentum towards this. There are commitments that are being made, and we have the technologies. We need to start taking action. I think that's kind of the key. So, Mike, I'll jump over to you. We talked about tipping points. How have we reached tipping points with our customers? When we talk to our customers, are we there? And then what is the roadmap for CSPs in North America so that they can continue to deploy 5G in an environmentally and financially sustainable way as well?
Okay. Yeah, and I think Kim's was a nice segue. We
Yeah.
look at the very high level. I'll go down slightly lower level. And I'd say in general, we haven't quite hit the tipping point in North America yet. And Kim and I were discussing before the session, there's a difference between regions.
Mm.
So I'll speak mainly for the US right now.
Right.
So what I mean by that is, I haven't seen any case where we would upgrade a radio or modernize just because of sustainability, or choose a vendor because of sustainability. We're not quite there yet. That being said, there's a lot of pressures coming. So we mentioned that every operator has targets to reach net zero in the next 10 to 15 years. And for the carbon neutral part, they relied on renewables. And the pricing was pretty good in the past, but the last few years it's actually started increasing in the US. So maybe that's not it won't work as well as it has so far. Then the other thing is, the promise of 5G was always to provide a new way of monetizing mobile networks. And that hasn't quite panned out as well as we thought. There is some increases, but not as well. So there's a pretty high pressure to reduce costs these days. And as we noted, 30-40% of operator OPEX is on energy consumption in the RAN network. And then you'd pointed me, Bhushan, to a nice GSM study that said, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, 30-40% of subscribers are actually willing to pay more to purchase service from an operator who has good sustainability credentials. So I think, maybe we haven't hit the tipping point, but there's new pressures that are coming that are maybe encouraging it a little bit more. Then for the solutions, we have solutions at different levels, product, site, and network level. But one of the best things we can do is actually, it seems ironic, is deliver less radios. And we can do that by things like we have one radio, 6646, that's tri-band, tri-sector, 40% less energy, 60% less weight. So depending on your starting point, it's going from 3 radios to 1, or 6 to 1, or even 9 to 1. So less radios. So that's enabled, by the way, by some of our silicon capabilities. We have another one, 4485, reduces energy by 22%, weight 53%. And now we're starting to track embodied carbon, meaning how much carbon is emitted from the production of the product and its transportation right to the site. And our Louisville factory actually plays a role in that, because clearly, if you're making it in Louisville, Texas, your transportation distances are much less than if you're bringing it overseas. So we have some great products coming along like that. I'll talk about a little bit more later. But I think, Kim, you hit it on the nail before about what are the actual incentives for even individuals to pay more attention to this. You gave the telephonic example. Now in the US, we largely, I think operations VPs are largely get their bonuses based on hitting KPIs, network KPIs, downlink throughput, call success rate, things like that. But we need to move more towards, well, there's a sustainability KPI now. Did you reduce energy consumption by 20%? So we need those triggers to help the tipping point.
Right.
Right.
So I think it's more about how do you integrate sustainability within how decisions are made. And I think there's a really interesting question that popped up here that I would like to put to both of you. So what more will prompt decision makers to kind of lean in even more and start kind of including climate action and sustainability as a key criteria? I think it's one of the criteria right now. But how do we kind of make that become a key criteria for decision making? Because that's kind of seems to me where the biggest impact can be delivered. So I don't know, Kim, if you want to start.
Sure. I'll start again with the high level, and we have a decision maker, C-level decision maker with us to give us the firsthand perspective. So the question was what's going to cause executives to lean into sustainability? And kind of one way that when we talk with clients, is that the world is a bit uncertain right now. And when we think about sustainability, as you mentioned, Mike, it may not be the number one concern, right? In North America, mobile network operators may not be selecting vendors or network infrastructure companies based on just sustainability. But as a C-level executive, the way that I see sustainability, again, it may not be the number one thing, but it feeds directly into the highest level of concerns at the enterprise level. And what do I mean by that? It feeds into brand reputation, right? What if my competitor is investing in 100% renewable energy? Are they getting younger subscribers? Am I doing enough to address climate action? So it affects brand reputation, the power to attract investors. We talked about the global markets piece that affects market value. We talked about the power to attract partners, right? So much, whether it's smart building, smart agriculture, right? Ericsson would partner with 1, 2, 3 different partners to integrate, an operator for the connectivity, and then you have an end-to-end system integrator, and then you have the infrastructure provider, and then you have the software maker, right? To gain these partnerships, right? Companies want to see that other companies like Ericsson are also investing in affecting the climate crisis. So that affects, again, a highest priority. And then again, some of the surveys and data that we're seeing, a large Deloitte survey of Gen Z and millennials, I think they survey over 22,000 Gen Z and millennials, and their second concern was climate change. Like, what is your highest concern? And it was right below cost of living. So if you think about the workforce and think about attracting and retaining your employees, again, sustainability may not be, cost, may not be innovative features, may not be performance, low latency, throughput, may not be all of those factors, but again, it feeds at the highest level into things that are really important to companies.
Great perspective, Mike.
Yeah, I think maybe what I could add to that is I think you cut the top level. I mean, business basics: make money, reduce costs. Hello.
Right. Simple as that.
So the making money part, maybe it's the investor part and consumer sentiment is starting to shift more towards this being more important. On the cost part, we're still quite new at some of these things. So, some of the products I mentioned are new. Some of the algorithms we use for deep sleep are relatively new. And I can see a little bit in our customers some hesitancy in the sense of, show me the proof, Let's do a trial site. Let's see the results, do A/B comparison. Okay, then I'll start buying in. So that's kind of the phase we're at now. We're doing lots of trial sites and numbers like I quoted. But I think once we get over that hump that everybody becomes a believer, then the cost part will start playing, maybe being a little more aggressive as well.
Interesting. So I think when I hear both of you kind of talk about how this is being leaned in, to me, it sounds like our consumers are asking us to redefine what best networks are. And best networks need to be, high performance. They need to be energy efficient, but then sustainable also needs to become a key perspective. So let's kind of go into the final section that we have, which is more focused on this idea of transformation. So Mike, I'll start with you here. So Ericsson as a company, we have committed to reaching net zero, and we really appreciate the recognition, Kim, from ABI for the efforts that our colleagues globally are doing to make sure they innovate and move our industry towards net zero. But how do you see, Mike, our company's strategies to net zero really enabling our customers to reach to their net zero objectives?
Well, at the starting point is I think you have to walk the talk.
Yeah.
As within your own company operations, and that was one of the reasons we actually made the Louisville factory. It's a smart factory from inception. In 2019, it was a $100 million investment. About 500 people worked there. Carbon neutral from day one, 70% less water, and the only telecom sustainability lighthouse in the U.S. So that's it's kind of like evidence of walking the
Reach
talk.
the commitment, yeah.
Then at a corporate level, we had targets we put out a few years ago about reducing the energy consumption of our radio products by 35% from 2016 to 2022. We actually hit and exceeded that. And we had a target of decreasing the watts per bit in 5G versus 4G by 10x. We achieved that. And so now we're going on to the next step in terms of our corporate targets. And there we have a net zero target of 2030, which is 10 years ahead of the science-based targets for our sector. And having, again, our radio emissions from our portfolio and our supply chain by 2030. So that's Ericsson, the company. But then in the products, I mentioned a couple of the products. We're also doing a lot of interesting things on the site level and the network level. So we have, again, everything's about proof of the pudding, right? So in Germany, in Dittenheim, we put in a renewable energy site and ended up, we could 17% could be produced from solar power from that. And by modernizing hardware and software, we got another 24%. Similar thing in Indonesia, modernizing, we got 20-30% from modernizing, 8% from AI features to put radios into sleep mode. And more recently, Far East Tone in Taiwan, we did a 50-site trial, and with these radio energy control feature, reduced consumption by 25%. So we're doing the product level, site level, network level from Ericsson's part to help our customers in that. Again, it always, at the end of the day, it comes back to, are they ready? Is the tipping point. We hit the tipping point here.
There's a good follow-up question that I might actually ask you, Mike. So you talked about the product commitments that we have and the reductions that we have driven. But there is also product solutions and then there's site solutions. Can you talk a little bit about that and how they kind of build on top of each other? So more of the microscopic view from a product perspective, and then a more macro view to the site and the network.
Yeah, as I noted, there's these three levels: product, site, network.
Right.
So the products, we're hitting about 15 to 20% improvement in energy consumption in each generation. So that's the product level. So now you put the product on the site has to get energy, of course.
Right.
So what we're doing there is looking at different sources of energy: wind, solar, normal electrical power. And we have an energy controller which can manage the switching between various forms of energy automatically and take advantage of best usage at that particular time. Then going up to the network level, it's all about looking at clusters or subnetworks and turning radios on and off during idle time or whenever is appropriate, such as another cell could take over the traffic. So those are the kind of three tiers.
Great. So I think keep the questions coming. There's some really interesting questions coming through. But I think in the last 10 minutes or so that we have, let's kind of switch a little bit and talk about kind of the transformation. So we kind of started talking about that. So Kim, I'll go back to you now. So clearly, reducing energy consumption is a key strategy for reaching net zero. Can you touch a little bit more about what you're seeing in terms of the roles that renewables and carbon offsets are going to play in this?
Sure. So at ABI Research, and certainly we discussed earlier in the keynote discussion that switching to renewable energy for the electricity to power the networks is perhaps it's rapid decarbonization for perhaps what might be a marginal cost. Once you've ascertained the legal staffing and the know-how to do a large power purchase agreement or virtual power purchase agreement. You can also hedge against the cost of future electricity. So that's something else. It's signing long-term, 15, 20-year contracts, in some cases with a specific wind or solar provider. We're seeing that as well, and that's additive to the grid, right? Additive to the network. Yes. So all of that is very helpful. And then I also see, Mike mentioned you've got to walk the walk. We see this enabling effect of how the telecom industry can lead in this area, right? But to lead, we have to have rapid decarbonization of the telecom sector itself. And then now we go out and discuss all the revenue. We try to talk about revenue opportunities for telecom, for mobile network operators and infrastructure suppliers to generate revenue from decarbonization. Again, helping with those incentives, hopefully some support from government incentives. So that's what we see as the role of renewable electricity in the U.S. Certainly, T-Mobile US is already in 2021 at 100% renewable energy use. Verizon, we mentioned, has issued just as its fifth, $1 billion green bond. Again, that's lower cost to finance the renewable energy. So again, you have to utilize all of these incentives with green programs. So we see large purchases. Certainly AT&T, and if you go on the EPA Green Power Partnership, and again, it moves around a bit, but you will always see the major U.S. telecom networks in the top 10 or top 5 often of that list. So again, I see the telecom sector as providing leadership for using renewable energy to power the networks, and then also the massive opportunity for using this equipment to decarbonize other industries is also another part of the importance of the sector.
Right. And I think that's something key for us to recognize, is that one of the great things I think about our sector is that all of these investments that our sector is in making in renewable energy, that's putting more renewable energy on the grid, just decarbonizing the entire utility grid, which is a great thing for us to say. But you touched on something important. I'm going to jump to that as the next question.
Okay.
So far we've been talking about sustainability for the ICT, but what we've also recognized here within Ericsson is that the potential of the ICT sector in enabling other sectors to kind of decarbonize. So Mike, maybe we'll start with you first here now. Can you share some thoughts about, what is this potential? What have we seen? What can we do to enable other sectors?
Yes. So does anybody remember the 5G triangle? So 5G was trying to do 3 things. One was enhance mobile broadband, ultra reliable, low latency communications, and massive machine type communications, or massive IoT. And that massive IoT is largely aimed at digitizing other sectors. And digitizing usually means automation. Almost always automation has some effect on energy consumption. So even though the ICT sector only consumes about 1.4, 1.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, or produces, it has the ability to impact much more. We see numbers like 15 to 20%. And there's 1,000 examples abound about this, but I'll give you a couple close to home. So, we talked about the alphabet soup. I'm going to completely kill everybody with the alphabet soup now. So we are the sole provider of 2 networks into the National Science Foundation, called the NSF PAWR AER PAWARA.
Wow.
And NSF, Platform for Advanced Wireless Research, and then the 2 subparts are for drones and for agriculture.
Okay.
And so I was looking at some of the use cases last night from agriculture, and they're absolutely fascinating. But one is, to put sensors in the ground to detect the amount of nutrients, and then by doing so can do targeted fertilization of a field rather than the entire field. So clearly you get some sustainability benefit from that. You're not bringing fertilizer across the entire field.
Right.
Probably you get better productivity, probably use less fertilizer. So 5G used for these kind of purposes, digitizing industries, has tremendous impact on multiple levels, of which sustainability is one. In the US, the energy sector is, I think it's the largest consumer.
Yeah, one of the top.
Or not
sources
consumer,
of
one
emissions.
sources of carbon emissions, largely due to coal, 25%. And the government has set a target of 100% carbon neutral by 2035.
Yeah, carbon pollution free, I think is the term, right?
Yeah. And in Ericsson, we have a growing enterprise business, and any given week we probably have 100 deals in various stages of progress, and many of them are from the energy sector, by the way. And in the energy sector, things are becoming far more distributed. You could say far more complicated, because wind and solar everywhere, even households producing energy. So controlling that has become a bit of a headache. So in this case, 5G would apply by having sensors in various places and controllers, so you can automate all that and thereby be more efficient in the grid itself. So there's just endless use cases for 5G applied this way.
Yeah, I think especially that use case you talked about with fertilizer. I think there's a huge environmental impact in we always see news in Florida where all this agricultural runoff fertilizer leads to algal bloom. So there's a lot more algae that happens in the ocean and kills the marine wildlife. So if we can take these initiatives, I think they could drive a big impact. Kim, what are your thoughts on this topic?
It's also, I know for that, the kind of smart agriculture applications, and there are some telco mobile network operators already in Europe who have formed various partnerships. Water reduction is a big piece of that too, right? Not only do you have IoT sensors doing soil content, fertilizer, moisture content, humidity, measuring all types of, you mentioned the drones, they can go out remotely with some type of private 5G network in the fields, right? They can go out and absorb, hey, what's happening to my crops? Do I have issues with my crops that I need to address? Or, they can do all of that remotely. And again, we're seeing mobile network operators, again, it's a bit of a paradigm shift, but they're generating revenues if you find the right partners with the expertise, whether it's a network operator partnering with a digital health firm or a network operator partnering with system integrators for private 5G networks, whether it's at a port facility or in a large industrial facility, or if it's in the agricultural space, or smart cities, smart municipalities. Certainly we've seen a lot of carbon reduction, energy use. We have smart lighting in cities. We have water use reduction. We have waste management, connectivity. We have all types of applications. Like you said, the list is endless. We just have to be creative. There's a bit of a paradigm shift. And, one thing we were talking about earlier, Bhushan, is at a high level, we know that it's going to cost a lot less to invest in climate action as opposed to the cost of inaction. I cited the Swiss Re Institute. Again, they did a climate stress test and said that by 2050, global GDP could be reduced by 18% if there's no action taken to address climate change. So again, I think governments are calculating the cost of inaction. They're also calculating, intense wildfires, intense hurricanes. We had devastating flooding in Pakistan. We had record high temperatures in the EU last year. So governments are also calculating the cost of inaction. And I think that will help incentivize some of these 5G applications to address that.
Great. I feel like we could keep talking, but I think we need to wrap up because I'm getting the warning sign here. but maybe if I were to kind of quickly summarize, to me, my reflection from this conversation is that, again, there's commitments, there's drivers. We need to action. I feel is the key word here. Is that action is what's really required. But the good news again is that we have the technologies available. So I wanted to kind of conclude today by thanking the both of you for sharing your perspective. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And again, for the audience, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for the questions. Please engage with us. This is a shared responsibility for our sector. Looking forward to working with you. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of the day.